Them's the rules.
We can't break those.
Morning, Pastor.
Good morning. I do have 3 palms. That is correct. And yet not enough to juggle. How is that? You know? Don't ask how many cheeks I have. All right, kids, I'm going to lay down some ground rules. No fencing or whacking your neighbor during Bible study. During Bible study. I don't know. I'm going to wait for the thumbs up from the booth. Oh, I guess we started. Okay. Last week, do you remember I was about to launch into a stand-up comedy set? And then I got the thumbs up, so I had to kill it real quick. One of these days. One of these days. It's great. It's about the Mediterranean diet. You'll like it. All right. Week 40. Oh, I don't need it. For those who are watching in the future, today is Palm Sunday. No, people will watch this in the future, right? I had a friend who was watching on Friday of last week, right? So, we here in the past greet you. These were the good old days. Well, where are we at? We have been 40 weeks into the book of Acts, and now you know more about Acts than you ever thought you would. Have you noticed that Lutherans don't tend to study this book all that much? We're all about the epistles, man. Even more than the Gospels, probably. You know? And there's reason for that, but this is important, man. This is important, and it helps you read the epistles better, right? And I think it makes a really good lens for seeing the world. I've said this in here before, I believe, but I'm going to say it again. As we have a gradually less Christian by default culture, right? When less and less you can look around and assume somebody is a Christian, the closer we are to living in an environment like what we read in the book of Acts, which should have some reassurance to you. Like, first of all, that we don't need prevailing culture to carry the weight of our church. Like, we don't need that. The gospel can stand on its own, thank you very much. And secondly, some of the examples we see in the lives of these apostles, maybe the application to our own lives gets a little bit easier, you know? Maybe we have to take a few less interpretive steps. All right, let's get some context. Let's dive in. It's great to see you guys. How are y'all doing today? Yeah. Y'all look very sunny. All right. So, where were we? Paul. Well, broad brushes. The book begins with the disciples and Jesus. And Jesus doesn't hang around for very long. In the first chapter, he ascends into heaven, and he tells them, wait here until you receive power from on high, and then I will make you my witnesses. If you know it, say it with me. I will make you my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Not many of y'all actually were there with me. All right, Jerusalem's a big capital city, right, of Judea. It's a big, you know. So that's a city, and then Judea is the surrounding country, basically, right? And then Samaria is the neighboring country with people of a shared but not perfectly shared lineage, right? So you get Jews in the capital of Jewishness in Jerusalem, right? And all throughout Judea, so named because it's where we call them Jews because of Judea, right? Samaria, which are people that they don't get along with, but at least are closer to them. They share some culture, they share some lineage. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth, which encompasses all humanity. And I read in my sermon last week, I read a verse in which Jesus tells them to go preach the gospel to all creatures. So I guess we can even spread the circle wider than humanity too, right? You know, so like deer, right? Snails, butterfly, fungi? Maybe. Alien visitors? Maybe. But at least as far as we're concerned, we've got a long way to go on preaching to the humans. So maybe we'll make that our focal point. And when we've got that on lock, we can move on to preaching to the lobsters or whatever, right? I think our first stop after humans might be dolphins, right? Yeah. I think they're likely to pick it up. Maybe. You're not so sure. Well, we'll just stick to people for now. Okay. Once we solve that problem, we can move on to other problems. Okay. All right, so Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. The story follows mostly Peter at that point and the disciples in Jerusalem. But most of the perspective is Peter. It might be Peter and John, or it might be Peter and the disciples, but mostly we follow Peter. And then we get introduced to this character, sort of a side character, sort of a villain, Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee. And you know about them Pharisees. Well, and we'll read his story explicitly from his own lips later on, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But Saul becomes Paul, and there's a bit of a transition in the book where we're kind of on Peter, kind of on Paul, and then as we move farther, we become more focused on Paul and his perspective. And one of the big reasons for that, well, two reasons. Number one, a lot of interesting stuff happens to Paul, so we want to hear that story. But number two, the guy who's writing the story down is with Paul, right? Luke is on the journey with them. And we know that because 2023, obviously, pronouns. Yeah. Well, it's not, it goes from them to us, which is pretty good. You know, it's like, oh yeah, and then they went on, no. Then we went on to, okay, I see what you did there. So we followed along the life of Paul. He's gone on some missionary journeys, moving away from everywhere he goes. If there's a synagogue, he goes there first, right? First preaching the gospel to the Jews. And that's the way Jesus said it too, right? He said, salvation first for the Jews and then for the Gentiles, right? Most of Jesus, but not all, but most of his ministry was to Jewish people. And that makes sense, right? They had received the law. They had prophets sent to them, right? But even back as far as Abraham, God says, I will make you a light to the Gentiles, right? You will be a blessing to all people. So God's plan of salvation was always for all humanity, right? But just like today, the vehicle for the gospel is the church, so in the Old Testament, the vehicle for the covenant was the people of Israel. And it was never all that exclusive, really. Because pretty much if anybody wanted to make Yahweh their God, it could happen, right? Okay. So anyways, we're following along Paul. He's going on this missionary journey farther away from Jerusalem. And he'll make stops. He'll go to the synagogue. He'll preach there as long as they'll have him. Usually they start off curious, and then they get angry. Or jealous more likely. And then he moves on to work with the Gentiles in the area who are believers. And he'll continue to preach, not in the synagogue, until eventually he gets run out of town for this or that reason. Notably, he almost never, I can't say never because I'd have to double check my facts, but I can say it is commonly the case that after whatever event leads him to know it's time to move on, he doesn't leave immediately. He goes, gives a word of encouragement to the church there, and then he leaves. And that's probably notable Because a man who leaves in fear doesn't go back to do that. A man who's been beaten doesn't do that, right? But a man who says, you know what? It's time for me to move on. He's in no particular hurry. And this happens to Paul. He'll get arrested. He'll get set free. He'll go back to the church and say, with many trials and hardships, you will enter the kingdom of heaven, right? Follow my example. It's going to be great. This cycle continues. Where we are in the story, it's coming up on the Feast of Tabernacles, and Paul wants to get to Jerusalem because God has told him, you got to get there. So Paul resolves to go, but he knows what's waiting for him. He makes a stop off on the way because there's no direct flights, right? Ship's got to come into port and maybe have to hop on another ship, whatever. So he's on his way. He's got his, connection there. The believers in that town come out to him. People prophesy over him saying, don't go. He's like, I have to go. What the prophets are saying is, if you go, these hardships will happen to you. And they conclude in their own hearts or minds, so don't go. Paul already knows about the hardships and difficulties. And he's convinced in his heart that God has told him to go. We wrestled with this a little bit last week, but are these conflicting messages? No. They are an opportunity for Paul to give a testimony about commitment to following God and the value of the gospel. Right? He is not deterred by hardship. He's not deterred by even potentially his own death. God has called him thus. He is going to go. He will fight the good fight. He will run the race. He will keep the faith. Right? So he makes his next stop. Guess what? 4 young ladies, they come and they prophesy over him. Another prophet comes, takes off Paul's belt, ties his hands and his feet together, says, the guy who owns this belt, this is going to happen to him if he goes to Jerusalem. Paul's like, I know. And they're all like, please, Paul, don't go. And they're all crying. And Paul's like, stop. I'm going, okay? You're just making it harder on me. So that was a vehicle for us last week to talk about how sympathy and compassion, they seem like they're virtuous, but maybe it's not a all-in-one solution to Christian charity, right? Maybe sometimes it's not the right move, right? Maybe sometimes the move is to say, we're praying for you. We appreciate you. Thank you for your partnership in the gospel. And may God bless you. Right? So Paul goes on. Gets to Jerusalem. When he gets to the temple, people are like, awesome, so good to see you. Not to the temple. When he gets to where the believers are, right, to the church, he visits James, right? And they're like, awesome, we've heard great things. But we've got a lot of Jewish believers too, right? You get that? Like, the church isn't just Gentile. We've got some Pharisees, and they're kind of making a buzz, but they believe in Jesus. But they're a little sketchy about you. They say that you're telling people that we should disregard Moses and all the law says. Of course, we don't think that. But people are saying it. So, would you prove them wrong? We've got some guys who are wrapping up a vow. I want you to take them to the temple. I want you to pay for them to get their heads shaved and all the rituals done. That way people can see that out of your own pocket, you're willing to put your money where your mouth is. You do uphold the law. You do affirm the Holy Scriptures, right? Paul's like, okay, yeah, if that's what it takes, I'll do that. So he goes to the temple. He's doing the thing, which is mostly an exercise in just proving his theology is not all whack, right? Well, he's there, and some of the people who gave him a hard time in Asia are there as well, because this is the Feast of Tabernacle. It's a pilgrimage festival. So, of course, the devout Jews who can make the trip are there. So the people that who have just been dogging his steps the whole way, people that went town to town to harass him, well, here they are in Jerusalem. And the thing about being in Jerusalem is now they have a little bit of horsepower behind their protesting, right? So they start stirring up trouble. All right. A riot just about breaks out, right? And they arrest him. That's where we left off last week. I'll just read a few verses and then we'll dive right into our study for today. So let's start at Acts 21, verse 28. All right, so people saw Paul. They thought he had brought a Gentile into the temple because they had seen him walking with a Gentile earlier. And they said, "Men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place." Wait, why did he go to the temple in the first place? Do you remember? Yes, to demonstrate that he obeys and upholds the law. He goes there, and for all his trouble and his cash, he gets accused of the exact thing that he's trying to prove against. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. All right, skipping ahead a little bit. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Okay, when we start talking about tribunes and cohorts, we're not talking about Israel, right? We're not talking about Jewish authority. We're talking about Roman authority. So the Roman government's getting involved now. He took soldiers, and centurions ran down to him, and when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. So this is in fulfillment of that prophecy. Remember with the belt? He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. Does that sound familiar? From any mobs shouting for the arrest of somebody in Jerusalem? Just say it. Jesus, right? Remember, just like we saw Stephen learn how to die from Jesus, we're also seeing Paul enduring the same sort of persecutions in the same way as Jesus. This is not accidental. And he could not learn the facts because of the uproar. He ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." This is where we're going to pick up afresh today. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, so he probably said this in Greek, and the tribune said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, let's just pause on that for a minute and we'll get on to what he said. All right, so clearly this tribune doesn't understand what's going on. He thinks he's got a dangerous criminal on his hands, right? Because what were his opponents shouting? They were crying for help. "Help me," right? Well, what was the danger Paul posed? In theory, maybe blasphemy. It's not really a Roman problem. But there's such fervor and such uproar that the Roman thinks there's like some life or death stuff going on here. Now, theologically, you can make a case blasphemy is life or death stuff, right? It's a good case to make. I'm glad you did. But from the Romans' perspective, like, this is nonsensical. And again, this is the same sort of thing that happened with Jesus. Remember, Pilate has Jesus, and he's like, I don't see what he did wrong exactly. So here's what I'll do. I'll give him an easy choice. I will take a violent criminal and Jesus, who seems to be clever, but gentle. And I'm going to just put those out there as an A-B choice, and we'll let people decide. Obviously, they're going to let Jesus go, because who wants to let this guy go? And guess what the people chose? Let the murderer go, right? All right. Oh, anyways, so Paul's asking if he can address the crowd, right? What was the accusation from the crowd? Why do they want him arrested? Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, he's an enemy of the faith, right? Which is to say, he's pro-Gentile, right? And it is to say that he opposes the law of Moses. So he stands up and he speaks to them in Hebrew, right? He knows Greek, it's the common language. Presumably everybody there would have too. And he could have spoken in Greek, and then the civil authorities would have been clued in. That would have probably been the more prudent political move. But that's not what he's doing. He speaks to them in Hebrew. Why in Hebrew? Yes, he's speaking to them in their language, the language that the scriptures would have been written in and read in. Yeah. I have a note later on, but I'll point to it now. In Philippians, Paul refers to himself as like, I am the Jews' Jew, right? When it comes to the Old Testament, I'm the guy, right? There is nobody who is more zealous for God's law than me, right? And so he's demonstrating that. I can read a Hebrew Bible okay with some, with some resources. I couldn't just stand up here and start teaching Bible class in Hebrew, right? Being that the people of Israel are pretty well scattered and living in all these different places, they might not be conversing in Hebrew every day, So Paul's demonstrating something here. Hebrew is not the lingua franca. Anyways, so here's what he says. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. We're in Acts 22. And when they heard he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. Notice he's trying to say, I'm not your enemy. I'm your brother. Right? Y'all are zealous for God? That's good. I am zealous for God. I'm no stranger to Jerusalem. This is a second home to me. I was born in Tarsus, but this is where I grew up. I studied under Gamaliel, for goodness sake. And we'll talk about Gamaliel here in a minute. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. For them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. Okay. So far, so good. Let's talk a little bit about Gamaliel. Does somebody have a Bible handy? Acts chapter 5. Let me know when you got it. 5:33 to 40. Can somebody just read that for me nice and loud?
When they heard this, they were furious and wanted to put them to death. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin, "Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people into revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go, for if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God."
That was Paul's teacher. Couple things to note. That's earlier in the same story, right? That was before, Gamaliel said those things before Paul was trying to franchise the persecution of the Christians into other cities, okay? Gamaliel was a Pharisee and one who apparently commanded some respect. Paul throws his name out there as if people should recognize it. But also, you'll note that he spoke in the Sanhedrin and they listened, right? And his counsel was, think this through with me, his counsel was, let this little sect die because their leader is already dead, right? These Jesus followers, well, Jesus is dead. And since he's dead, the movement will die with him if you don't stoke the flames, right? So he said, don't persecute the Christians. Now, the student of a rabbi is supposed to become like the rabbi. That's the goal, right? Oh, this is key. This is key. Don't oppose them, because if they're wrong, it'll come to nothing. But if they're right and we oppose them, we may be opposing God. Well, what does Paul do? He goes off and persecutes the Christians. In his zeal for God, but misplaced, and not recognizing who God is. Or let's even put it this way, because this is a broadly applicable point that's difficult, I think, for us Christians who are compassionate. If you have zeal for God but reject his Son, you will oppose God. That's what happened to Paul. Knew the Bible, believed the Bible, had zeal for God, but rejected his Son. There is no path to God that rejects the Son. When you reject the Son, you put yourself at odds with the Father. That's the lesson of Saul of Tarsus. Okay, so that's a little peek at Gamaliel and how Saul sought to leap over the righteousness of his teacher, right? As I was on the way and drew near Damascus, I'm at verse 6, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. You know, that's a note I didn't pick up on our reading previously, but this is interesting. How much light does it take for you to notice it at midnight? Not much. Have you ever tried to read yourself, like an email on your cell phone at noon outside? Why is it difficult? When I woke up this morning and checked the weather, my eyes were blinded by my cell phone. And in the noonday, I can barely make it out, right? This great light shone on Paul at noon. That had to be real bright, right? Real bright. Okay, sorry. I digress. Where did I leave off? 7, thank you. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. Hold on a second. What blinded Paul?
Light.
Who saw the light?
Everybody.
Yeah, they all saw it. There's probably something here, right? Probably something like, I don't think everybody saw the same intensity, right? Because they weren't all struck blind. And Paul says it was the brightness of the light that blinded me. You know, I think this happens in church quite often. You know, you come to worship, right? And you get 2 people in the same service, and one's a little bit bored and playing Wordle, you know? And then there's somebody else who's just being knocked over by whatever God is saying that day. And you got the same word, you know? But there is something subjective about this stuff. And there are times when God will just, you know, hit you right here. And maybe not them. Maybe if they were more receptive. Or maybe it's just not that message for that day. You know? I do think it's interesting, though, that it's a two-way thing, right? There's the phenomenon, but there's also the person experiencing it. And I think it does make a difference. And I think it's fascinating that God allowed the other guys to see some light, even if they couldn't quite make out the voice. Paul had a whole different level of it going on, you know? And I think it's because this is sort of like Jonah. I talk about Jonah a lot. It's one of my favorite books. But it's sort of like Jonah, right? Where God, you know, Jonah's on this boat full of sailors. So let's just use this example. He's on a boat full of sailors. And God's trying to get through to Jonah. But he also gets through to the guys on the boat. But his message isn't for them. His message is for Jonah. But they're in the splash zone. Quite literally. You know? And the consequence there is when they get to shore, they make sacrifices and offer vows to Jonah's God. So we want to think about Paul because it's a story about God and Paul. But if you were one of the guys with Paul on this journey, you would be telling the story too. And part of that being your perspective of it. All right. Let's keep going, because this is all stuff that we've talked about in the past. And one Ananias, not to be confused with Ananias the high priest, we'll see that in a little bit. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law. Notice the distinction here, right? He is a faithful Jew who observes the law of Moses. Right. A devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and I saw him. And he said, God, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. a little, because I'm a Lutheran, little brief snippet on that text there. You'll notice, and maybe I'm quibbling, but Ananias in this moment doesn't say, are you ready to accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior? Okay, let's make a declaration and baptize you. He doesn't do that with baptism at all, right? He says, hey, Jesus had a message for you. Now you should be baptized and have your sins washed away. This is the kind of text that informs our theology of baptism that somebody who has a different theology of baptism would have to interpret a little bit differently, And I'm not trying to poke anybody in the eye, but people often want to know what are the differences between Lutherans and other Christians, and this is one of those places where we don't believe in baptism as being your public declaration of your love for God or your faith in God. We do have a moment for that. We call it confirmation. But rather, this is one of those things we would point to and say, see how Ananias is inviting him to receive the gift of baptism that God is offering for the washing away of his sins. Hopefully that tracks for you. Let's keep going.
What chapter are you in?
Chapter 22. Yep. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, him being Jesus, right? Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Okay. So we don't get that conversation with Paul earlier in the book. We're only getting it now that he's sharing it with us, because it was a private thing that happened. Nobody could observe it. And unless he talked about it, nobody would know. God is saying to Paul, you got to get out of Jerusalem, because they will not receive your testimony here. Is that because he has a no good testimony? No. But it is because he carries a lot of baggage from his history. You remember when Jesus was walking around ministering to people? Those were the days, right? You remember Jesus had a preaching ministry where he walked around, talking, healing, all that kind of stuff. And he did outstanding stuff. But Galilee and Nazareth in particular were tough spots for him to preach. Because when he was there, people looked at him and said, isn't this like Joe the contractor's son? Like, what does he know? My kid played kickball with him. Like, how is he going to just do stuff, right? Now, I would say that was an even milder version of what's going on here. But Jesus had some level of frustration, right? Because he was in those places. He did some healing, but it said he couldn't work many wonders amongst them because of their lack of faith. And I think God is saying to Paul sort of a similar thing. The people here are primed to not listen to you. But you have a testimony that I want to use. So I'm going to send you to people who don't have that bias. I'm going to send you to people who aren't primed in that way. People, for instance, that you maybe didn't hear. Believers are afraid of you, most likely, or at least they used to be. There are people here probably that you arrested loved ones, right? You might have overseen the execution of friends, neighbors. They're not ready for you yet. So I'm going to send you out. It's probably hard on Paul, in a sense. It might be a relief, because a fresh start's nice. I remember one of the things I liked about going to college was nobody knew me as a dumb high schooler, right? Or as a dumb middle schooler. I was just a fully formed, mostly adult. I could just start fresh, you know? Like when I got here, none of y'all knew how weird and broken I was, right? I was just the pastor, you know? And then after a while, when the sunken cost fallacy sinks in, then you're like, well, yeah, but I guess it's too expensive to get rid of him now. Now we got to go through a call process again? Oh, nobody wants that. But that fresh start thing, it does help, right? But it was where Paul came up. I mean, got a lot of memories in that place, and some are going to be good, even though maybe there's a lot of regret and sadness baked into, Anyways, so he makes his journeys. He's out in the world. He's going to reflect back on this, though, right? This is what I was going to say. Philippians chapter 3. I've got it. I'm just going to read it to you. This is Philippians 3, starting at verse 4. He says, I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. By the way, that is a Hebrew idiom, right? The blank of blank means the most blank thing, right? So like the Holy of Holies is the most holy place. The King of Kings is the kingest guy, right? He's the kingest guy. Hebrew of the Hebrews, like I'm the most Hebrew. It's a superlative if you're a language dork like me. All right. Hebrew of the Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Now, you might think of a number of reasons internally that might be true, but I think there's a practical application to that too, which is to say, because of all that stuff I'd put so much stock in, which had led me to be on the opposite side from God, I could not minister in Jerusalem. Now, I don't think that's all that he's saying, but I do think it's part of what he's saying. All that stuff I'd put stock in hurt my ministry once I came to know Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, which sounds very British to me, so I'm going to say count them as garbage in order that I may gain Christ. All right. Now, quick recap. Going back to verse 20, verse 21. He's in dialogue with Jesus, remember, right? And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Verse 22. Up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live here. Up until which word they listened to him?
So you said he was
Gentile. Yeah, Gentile. He's like, oh, okay, yeah, person, yep. Oh, you're one of them. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine this week about how I don't talk directly about like race relations in America very much. From the pulpit as a pastor. And I will talk about it in some ways, right? Like, for instance, I want you to know that Jesus loves everyone, regardless of their skin color, right? Jesus died for everyone. And no matter what color your skin is, it does not improve or tarnish your position with God in any way, nor should it in the church. right? But part of the reason that I don't, preach on it a lot is that there aren't many texts that handle it directly. And usually the texts are saying enough that I don't have to put stuff in there. But this is one of those places where I kind of want to point out that the Jew-Gentile divide might be something like this. It's not exactly one-to-one. The history isn't the same. You can't do it quite like that. But I do want you to notice that there's just an instinctive, automatic rejection of that which is Gentile. And whenever that happens, guess what? They're not on God's side when that happens. So if I have made it in any way ambiguous, let me make it absolutely clear. God loves everyone regardless of their ethnicity. And you don't get to choose who you love based on their ethnicity. Okay? But you see this irrational response when he says, God sent me to the Gentiles. And maybe they could try and defend it in scriptural ways, but they're wrong. So whatever scriptural defense they put up is wrong interpretation because God actually did send him to the Gentiles. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, I mean, they are emoting, okay? The tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks. So he was standing on the steps of the barracks as he gave this address, remember? So he had him brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging. Like you do. He should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. What does that mean to be examined by flogging? They beat him. Right. Yeah, they're trying to beat the truth out of him, right? We have research today that suggests that violence and the threat of violence will get people to say what you want, not necessarily what's true, right? But that's pretty recent. That's a pretty recent study that's come out. I don't think the Romans had heard about that. They thought you could beat the truth out of somebody, and that's what he intended to do. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, okay, so again, bear in mind, Paul doesn't do this until he's already assumed the position. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" I don't know why he likes to play chicken with this stuff. And sometimes he misses. They just go through with the flogging before he says something, right? But yeah, so he's there, he's stretched out. Maybe they could see the scars of where he's been beaten before. And just as they're about to, put the hammer down, so to speak, he says, "Can you do this to a Roman citizen?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yeah." And the tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Now you can hear an implicit question there, right? That tribune says, "I was not a citizen, I purchased it, and it's expensive." He's looking at Paul. I think he's looking at him going, "You don't look like you can afford that." Has Paul been living extravagantly? Not since the Damascus Road. Remember, on his most recent missionary journeys, he spent at least some portion of his time just paying for his own room and board by being a tent maker. So you can imagine, he might be a little on the lean side, and his clothes might be a little worn, and he does not look affluent, right? "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "But I'm a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him, withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Okay. This will be the last thing we get to today because I'm just about out of time. And it's just sort of a textual note. We don't know how Paul became a citizen. We know it's by birth, but what does that mean? So I'll put forward a few of the possible theories. None of them really change the story significantly. One is that he was born into a so-called free city, right? These are places where if you're born, you're just granted citizenship. As Americans, the whole country works like that, so that doesn't seem novel to us. But Roman citizenship was a highly prized thing, and it was not so automatic. So to be born in one of those free cities, that would be a really good deal. Is that the case for Tarsus? Don't know. We're not sure. Could be the case. Not sure. Is that the case for Paul? Could be. Another option might be that Paul's dad or Paul's grandfather was wealthy and did purchase citizenship, right? So his citizenship then transfers to subsequent generations. So it could be that, right? That maybe he comes from money. The other way that it could happen is it could, the Caesar can just, or presumably other higher-ups underneath him, can just say, hey, thank you for your service to the empire. I'm going to make you a citizen. Sort of like when universities hand out honorary doctorates to people. It's like, well, you didn't pay any tuition and you didn't take any classes, but we really like you. Now you're a doctor, right? So it could be that situation too. It could have been his father, grandfather, something like that. Some people have speculated maybe from military service. Did his father or grandfather serve in the Roman army? I don't know. If I had to make a guess, my guess is going to be either it's that free city situation where just being born there is good enough, and part of the reason I lean that way is because he talks about, I was born in Tarsus, a city of no small reputation, right? He said that earlier. So, but if that was commonly known, then maybe that would be enough that the guy should have known he was a citizen. So my best guess, for what it's worth, I think he comes from a wealthy family, right? And that also, kind of, when you come from a wealthy family, it's better to get your kids into good schools, right? Good tutors. And so that would position him well to get hooked up with a prominent rabbi and, all that kind of stuff. So that's where, if you have to make a guess, my guess is, comes from a wealthy family, they purchase the citizenship, and that's how it transfers down to him. Don't know. It's not going to make much difference to the gospel of Jesus, but I know you guys get curious about things, so there you go. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. Next week, we'll not do Bible study because it's Easter. Hey, remember, Easter, it's not going to be here because the weather's going to be beautiful. We're going to be out on the church property under a tent, having a good old time. I'll talk about that more in our announcements before church. Speaking of church, 6 minutes, so stick around.